Taxes suck. However, they're an unfortunate reality we all have to live with in order to live in a functioning, stable society. After all, without taxes, how would the government pay for stuff like roads, clean water, decent food, education, healthcare? Okay, maybe our government just sucks. But what if I were to tell you there's a better way to tax? A way to ensure entrepreneurs, workers, consumers, banks, investors, and the nation all benefit by eliminating all taxes and replacing them with just a single one. Welcome to the criminally underrated economics of Georgism. Before we can talk about what we can change, I think we should start with what we have. And in the case of the US tax system, what we have is pretty complicated. There's an income tax, which is paid by individuals and corporations. It's very progressive. There's a state income tax, a federal income tax, and a local income tax, each for individuals and corporations separately. There's a capital gains tax for assets, so for wealthy and luxury goods, where rich people might store their money. There's a Social Security and Medicare tax for those respective programs. There's an excise tax for things like alcohol, cigarettes, and smoking. Gasoline is there for some reason. Tariffs for like certain imports from certain countries, and a property tax. There's also estate taxes, personal property taxes, which are different from property taxes, various different local taxes on various different things. In fact, all of these have different local and state variations. Basically, it's dumb, overcomplicated, it doesn't work, and the US government knows exactly how much you owe and decides not to tell you, meaning you either use TurboTax or do your taxes yourself, meaning you'll most likely pay way more than you owe to the government, which the government also won't tell you about. So what does Georgism do that's different? Georgism, developed by political thinker Henry George, suggests that none of these taxes are actually necessary. Instead, they should all be replaced by just one tax, a land value tax, which is basically a property tax on steroids. Let's say we have a country called Country Circle, which looks less like a circle and more like a deformed oval, but bear with me, and the shaded part represents all the private property in the circle. At this point, I've mentioned land tax quite a bit, and you might be wondering how Georgism uses land taxes for its own economic benefit. Well, basically, instead of using income taxes, which tax salaries and wages, which burden workers and consumers, which decrease consumer spending and by extension real GDP, Georgism suggests that instead we should use land taxes, which directly tax the value of private property. So for example, for apartments, instead of taxing a tenant's income, you tax part of the rent the tenant pays to the landlord. For houses, instead of using property taxes to burden homeowners, you tax a portion of the mortgage the homeowner pays to the bank. And for factories, it would be profits, and for colleges, it would be tuitions, but no matter what, the common thread in all of this is that the taxes would burden the landowner. Now, there's a lot of benefits that Country Circle would get from enacting this kind of Georgian system, but I'm going to write down the 4 big ones in my opinion. So for starters, the most obvious benefit is that landowners like banks and landlords, they can't artificially raise the cost of living without consequence, since taxes increase in proportion to rent or mortgage instead of income. The second benefit is that it's incredibly easy to start a new business and accumulate wealth, since you only have to pay one tax as opposed to like the 70 we currently pay, and that one tax doesn't really interfere with assets or stocks, just profits. And both of those combined leads into benefit 3, which is where it's incredibly hard for big businesses to drown out competition and interfere with the free market, so it puts essentially a check on ultra-wealthy companies. And finally, point number 4, which is a sleeper, but definitely very important, is that it encourages really efficient land use. And what do I mean by that? Let's say in Country Circle, a plot of private land is being used inefficiently. Since the land is still private property, it's still taxed at a 10% rate. This cost would encourage people who own the private land to sell it to someone who would make it efficient and make it profitable. This may not seem like a big issue until you consider that us Americans, well, we don't really use our land very efficiently. Now you, being a practical person, might think, wow, Shobit, this idea seems great, but has it really been used anywhere effectively? And the answer, dear viewer, is yes. Very much so. In Denmark, a simple Georgis policy, a 3% tax for any land valued over $343,000, has led to some of the most efficient land use and best city design in all of Europe, as well as a fair free market for businesses and consumers alike. In Taiwan, the Georgis Kuomintang, influenced by their similarly Georgis founder, Sun Yat-sen, were able to use the land tax to make sure what little resources they had were utilized to the greatest extent, creating one of the most liberal and successful market economies not just in Asia, but in the world. And perhaps the crown jewel of Georgist achievement is none other than Singapore. Singapore's government owns all the land in the country, and one of the only taxes there is the Georgist land value tax. It has led to an economic boom and turned a resource-poor rock that seemed destined to starve into a capitalist economy so efficient and so successful that it's a gold standard for economic development. Georgism certainly isn't the sole factor of the successes of these countries, but it is certainly a major part of it. And the ideology, like any ideology, has its flaws. The big two, in my opinion, are A, it's pretty hard to objectively derive the monetary value of something like land, and B, once you have the tax money, how to use it. Most Georgists believe that the best way to spend that money would be to ensure free infrastructure and a universal basic income, but honestly, those deserve their own videos. In a world where the economic status quo is being understandably questioned, Georgism and the idea of a land tax, an idea that, mind you, not only predates Henry George, but has garnered many favorable opinions from economists as diverse as Adam Smith, Lord Keynes, and Milton Friedman, remains criminally out of the discussion. And at the very least, it's better than these.